Microcap biotech in early 2026 is completely dislocated. On the surface, it looks like chaos. Tiny companies under $5. Violent gaps on headlines, and charts that either go straight up or straight to zero. But underneath that chaos is a very specific setup. A handful of beaten-down names sitting right at the edge of major regulatory and clinical catalysts, where the math of asymmetric upside actually starts to make sense. Quick reminder before we go any further. I'm not your financial advisor. This video is for educational and informational purposes only and is not financial advice. Penny stocks and small caps are very risky, and you can lose all your money. Always do your own research or talk to a licensed professional before making any decisions. In this breakdown, we're going to zoom in on 3 microcap biotech names that sit right at that edge. Fortress Biotech, ticker FBIO on NASDAQ, Sellas Life Sciences, ticker SLS, and Aquestive Therapeutics, ticker AQST, all 3 trade under $5. All 3 are high-risk A, and each one represents a different flavor of biotech alpha, a realized win with an FDA approval and a hidden asset on the balance sheet, a binary event with a phase 3 survival readout approaching, and a distressed recovery after a sharp sell-off on an FDA deficiency letter. The goal here is not to tell you what to buy. The goal is to show you how an institutional investor might think about these names, where the upside could come from, where the thesis can break, and how you might size risk if you even touch them at all. Let's start with the backdrop. In 2025, the FDA approved more than 50 novel therapeutics. That pace of innovation has not slowed. What has changed is the bar. Regulators are pushing harder on manufacturing quality, trial design, and real clinical benefit. At the same time, microcap biotechs, especially the ones under $5, live in a strange pocket of the market. They're usually too small or too messy for big funds to touch. Their share prices often trade more on headlines and emotion than on the underlying biology, and they're heavily driven by binary events, trial readouts, FDA decisions, or major partnership deals. For professional money, this creates what you could call a barbell opportunity. On one side, you've got broken stories trading at or below cash, where the market has basically given up. On the other, you've got pre-catalyst stories where a single data readout or regulatory decision can completely reprice the stock. The 3 names we're looking at today sit along that spectrum, but with very different risk profiles. Before we go ticker by ticker, there's one structural thing we need to talk about: the under $5 problem. When a stock trades under $5, 2 things happen. First, a lot of institutional mandates simply can't touch it. Their rulebook says, no stocks under $5. No exceptions. That means these names often trade in a kind of orphan zone, thin liquidity, not much analyst coverage, and very noisy retail flows. Second, that same under $5 price point can act like a spring. If a biotech under $5 suddenly gets an FDA approval, a clean phase 3 win, or a big partnership or buyout rumor, it can jump above that level and into the zone where more funds are allowed to own it. It can qualify for small cap indices, and passive money is forced to buy. That transition from under-owned microcap to index-eligible small cap often looks from the outside like a short squeeze. In reality, it's a liquidity phase change. A lot more buyers are suddenly allowed, or forced, to show up. With that framework in mind, let's get into the first name. Fortress Biotech is not your classic single-drug biotech. Think of it more like a biotech holding company, or an incubator. It scouts drug assets, houses them in separate subsidiaries, keeps equity and royalties, and often partners commercialization out to bigger, better-funded players. The problem with that structure historically: the market hates complexity. All those subsidiaries, intercompany loans, and royalty agreements create what investors call a conglomerate discount. The parent company ends up trading at a fraction of what the underlying pieces might be worth if they were clean and standalone. That changed in a very real way on January 13, 2026, when Fortress crossed a genuine regulatory finish line. The key asset here is Zycubo, also known as CUTX-101, developed inside Fortress's subsidiary Cyprium Therapeutics. It targets Menkes disease, an ultra-rare pediatric disorder caused by mutations in the ATP7A gene, a gene critical for moving copper around the body. If you think of the body as a factory, copper is like a tiny multi-tool used in several critical machines. One machine runs energy production, one reinforces connective tissue, one regulates neurotransmitters, and one controls pigment production. In Menkes disease, the forklift that's supposed to move copper to those machines is broken. Copper doesn't get where it needs to go, the machines fail, and the result is a brutal set of symptoms: seizures, failure to thrive, neurodegeneration, with most untreated patients dying extremely young. Zikabo's approach is straightforward but powerful. Instead of relying on the broken transporter in the gut, it delivers copper histidine as a subcutaneous injection, essentially bypassing the broken forklift and dropping copper closer to where the body can use it. The result: in early treated patients, the median overall survival was around 177 months, almost 15 years, versus roughly 16 months in historical untreated controls. That's not a small incremental benefit. It's a complete rewrite of the disease's natural history. That's why the FDA gave the green light, despite small patient numbers. The signal was just too strong to ignore. Here's where the financial side kicks in. Fortress, via Cyprium, partnered with Sentinel Therapeutics, which is owned by the Zydus Group. Sentinel handles commercialization, sales force, and distribution. Fortress, through Cyprium, keeps eligibility for up to 9-figure milestones and a royalty stream on net sales of Zykubo. Orphan drugs for ultra-rare conditions often land in the $300,000 to $500,000 per patient per year pricing zone. The patient population is tiny, but the revenue per patient is very high, and the marketing is focused, which means margins can be attractive. But the real weapon in this story isn't just royalties. It's a specific FDA incentive called a Rare Pediatric Disease Priority Review Voucher, or PRV. A PRV is essentially a time coupon for big pharma. Normally, when a company files a new drug application, the FDA's standard review timeline is around 10 months. A priority review voucher lets them cut that to roughly 6 months. For a blockbuster drug, something in obesity, Alzheimer's, oncology, for extra months on the market can be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. That's why PRVs are transferable and have an active secondary market. Recent sales have gone for around $150 to $160 million each. In the case of Zykubo Cyprium, the Fortress subsidiary owns 100% of the voucher. Fortress owns a controlling stake in Cyprium, so Fortress has a claim on most of that value. Here's the simplified arbitrage. Fortress's market cap around the time of approval was roughly in the low hundreds of millions. The estimated value of the PRV alone is around. Fortress's economic share of that voucher is a large majority of that amount. In other words, the market was implicitly valuing the PRV at close to its full market price and the rest of Fortress's portfolio, the Zykubo royalties, other subsidiaries like Journey Medical and Checkpoint Therapeutics, at almost nothing. Once the PRV is sold, that cash can pay down high-interest debt, strengthen the balance sheet, and potentially fund more deals without immediate dilution. That's why FBIO is often framed as a realized win. The catalyst already happened. Now the story is about how quickly and efficiently they monetize it, and whether the market closes that gap between the PRV value and the current equity price. Here's the bull versus bear in 1 minute. The bull case. The PRV sale brings in a 9-figure, non-dilutive cash inflow, debt gets reduced, insolvency fears fade. The market is forced to actually value the royalty streams and the broader pipeline. And a re-rating to materially higher levels, potentially a multiple of pre-approval prices, looks reasonable. The bear case. Management misallocates the PRV cash into risky early-stage projects. The conglomerate discount persists because the structure remains complicated, or delays in selling the PRV stretch the timeline and keep the stock stuck. For now, though mathematically, Fortress looks like the least binary of the 3 names we'll discuss. If you appreciate this kind of calm, data-driven breakdown of high-risk, high-reward setups, rather than hype or fear, consider hitting the like button and subscribing to Penny Stock Pulse. It genuinely helps the channel and tells me to keep doing these deeper dives instead of surface-level content. Alright, that's the realized win. Let's move to the other end of the spectrum. The pure binary bet. Sellas Life Sciences is almost the opposite of Fortress. There's no big PRV in hand. There's no recently approved drug. Instead, everything revolves around one pivotal phase 3 trial called REGAL. The lead asset is galinpepimut-S, or GPS, a therapeutic cancer vaccine aimed at acute myeloid leukemia, or AML. GPS targets a protein called WT1, which is heavily overexpressed on AML cells and several other blood cancers. You can think of WT1 like a badge that cancer cells wear more prominently than healthy cells. That's why the National Cancer Institute ranks WT1 as a top target for cancer immunotherapy. The problem with earlier WT1 vaccines was this: they used the natural WT1 sequences. The immune system has seen that pattern before during development and kind of shrugs. This looks like self. GPS takes a different approach. It uses heteroclitic peptides, slightly modified versions of the WT1 fragments that bind more strongly to the immune system's display molecules and, as a result, trigger a stronger T-cell response. A simple analogy: if traditional WT1 vaccines were like showing the immune system a faded photocopy, GPS is like showing it a high-contrast highlighted version of the same picture. It's much harder to ignore. The trial is looking at AML patients who have already relapsed once, then gotten back into a second remission, a group with historically very poor survival on standard care. REGAL is an event-driven phase 3 trial. The primary endpoint is overall survival. The final analysis happens when 80 deaths have occurred across both arms. As of late December 2025, Sellas disclosed that 72 events had occurred, fewer than they originally projected by that point. Why does that matter? In this kind of trial, if the drug is doing nothing, you expect deaths to stack up on a fairly predictable timeline, especially in a high-risk relapse population. The fact that the last few events have been slow to accumulate has led some investors to what's called the long tail hypothesis. The tail of the survival curve is stretching. That could mean the treated patients are living longer than expected, and the statistical boundary for the final analysis is taking longer to hit. It's not proof. Clinical trials can surprise in both directions. But the delay, combined with the fact that the independent monitoring committee has not stopped the trial for futility or safety, is what's driving a lot of speculative interest here. From an investment perspective, SLS is about as binary as it gets. Scenario A: REGAL wins. There's a statistically significant survival benefit. GPS could become a maintenance standard in a very high-value AML niche. The stock could re-rate to a much higher range very quickly, and Sellas becomes a takeout candidate. Scenario B: REGAL fails. The stock likely collapses toward cash value, and the lead program is severely impaired. The one partial backstop is a second asset, SLS-009, a CDK9 inhibitor with encouraging response rates in difficult-to-treat AML. That doesn't make SLS low risk, but it does mean a failure in REGAL doesn't automatically make the equity worthless. Still, compared to Fortress, this is clearly a lottery ticket profile. You size this kind of exposure with the assumption that it can go to a fraction of its current value if the trial disappoints. Now let's move to the third name, where the risk is less about clinical failure and more about regulatory friction. Aquestive Therapeutics is a commercial-stage company best known for its PharmFilm technology, small, dissolvable strips placed under the tongue to deliver drugs systemically. The focus here is on Anaphylm, a sublingual epinephrine film aimed at treating anaphylaxis, severe allergic reactions that can be life-threatening. Right now, the standard of care for anaphylaxis is the epinephrine autoinjector products like EpiPen. They work, but they come with issues. They're bulky and awkward to carry. They're temperature sensitive. They involve a needle, which a lot of people fear, and many patients simply don't carry them consistently or freeze in the moment of crisis. Anaphylm's pitch is simple: instead of a pen, you carry something closer to a breath strip, a small, thin film that dissolves under the tongue and delivers epinephrine through the mucosa into the bloodstream. The science challenge is that epinephrine is not easy to absorb that way. Aquestive's technology is all about getting enough drug across that barrier fast enough to match injection-level exposure. Their clinical program has generated a large dataset, and key pharmacokinetic studies have suggested that Anaphylm can hit similar exposure levels to injected epinephrine on important metrics. The market is big, over $2 billion globally, and a needle-free pocket-friendly option that genuinely works could capture a meaningful slice of it. So why did the stock get crushed? On January 9, 2026, the company disclosed that the FDA had identified deficiencies in their new drug application for Anaphylm specifically. Deficiencies that preclude final discussions of labeling and post-marketing commitments. That language led to roughly a one-third decline in the stock in a single session. Here's the key nuance: this is not a refusal to file. It's not yet an outright complete response letter. It's essentially the FDA saying, we have issues that need to be resolved before we can finalize this review. In many cases, when these kinds of issues surface late in the process, they're related to chemistry, manufacturing, and controls. CMC, batch consistency, stability data, or facility-related questions. If the FDA believed the clinical data itself was fundamentally inadequate, that the drug doesn't work or isn't safe, the communication would usually look different, and often harsher. That's why some investors see the sell-off as an overreaction to a fixable, technical hurdle rather than a binary clinical failure. On the financial side, Aquestive is not a tiny pre-revenue shell. It has meaningful cash on the balance sheet. It has existing royalty streams and other programs. And it has optionality outside the US. Critically, regulators in other regions, like Europe and the UK, have signaled that no new major clinical trials are required for their reviews. That doesn't guarantee approval, but it reinforces the view that the science behind Anaphylm is considered credible by more than one agency. From a setup standpoint, AQST now trades as a distressed asset. The market has priced in a long delay or outright failure. If the ultimate FDA response focuses on manufacturing or process fixes, not efficacy, there is room for a re-rating as those issues get addressed. It's still high risk. But the risk is tilted more toward how long does it take to fix this, rather than does the drug work at all. So we've looked at three very different profiles. Fortress Biotech, a realized regulatory win with a monetizable PRV, and royalty streams that the market may not be fully valuing. Sellas Life Sciences, a beta binary event where the entire thesis sits on a phase 3 survival readout. Aquestive Therapeutics, a distressed recovery story where a scary FDA headline may or may not reflect a fixable technical issue. In a professional portfolio, you might think of these as components of a catalyst basket. FBIO as the anchor, still risky, but supported by a tangible asset and a clear path to cash inflow. SLS as the lottery ticket, very asymmetric, but very binary. AQST as the recovery trade, where the market may have overshot on bad news that isn't necessarily fatal to the program. The point is not that you need all three. The point is that the type of risk is different in each case, and your comfort level might be very different depending on which one you're wired for. The microcap biotech space in early 2026 is a case study in market inefficiency. The value of complex derivative assets like priority review vouchers, the statistical nuances of event-driven trials like REGAL, and the wording differences between regulatory deficiency letters and outright rejections are not always priced correctly in the first reaction. For investors willing to do the work, and to live with volatility, that gap between perception and reality is where potential alpha lives. But it cuts both ways. If the thesis breaks, if REGAL fails, if a PRV sale is delayed or misused, if a deficiency letter turns into a crushing CRL, the downside can be just as dramatic as the upside. If you found this deep dive helpful, hit like, subscribe to Penny Stock Pulse, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next Under the Radar breakdown. And let me know in the comments, which of these three risk profiles are you actually most comfortable with: the realized win, the binary event, or the distressed recovery story? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.